Welcome. And thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate you choosing to spend your time with this video. Whether you're here to unwind, to learn something new, or simply to enjoy a moment of calm. If you find these peaceful history documentaries relaxing or helpful, please consider subscribing and giving the video a like. It supports the channel more than you know, and helps these tranquil journeys reach others who may need them as well. Now, take a deep breath, settle in, and enjoy the story. The sea is quiet tonight. Along the windswept shores of the Hellespont, the last fires of a vast Macedonian army burn low beneath a silver moon. Horses stand tethered, spears glint in the starlight, and beyond the dark water lies Asia, the edge of the known world. At the heart of the camp, a young king cannot sleep. His name is Alexander, son of Philip, ruler of Macedon. And at just 20 years old, he stands on the brink of history. Tomorrow, he will cross this narrow sea and begin one of the greatest military campaigns ever known. Before him lies the Persian Empire, ancient, immense, and seemingly invincible. Behind him, a small hardened kingdom united by his father's ambition and his own restless dream. He looks east and whispers a promise to the gods, that his name will outlast marble and myth, that no horizon will be too far. But to understand how he came to this shore, how a boy from the rugged hills of northern Greece became the conqueror of worlds, we must go back. Back to a time before the legends, before the empire. Back to where it all began. Part 1. A Prince of Macedon. The year is 356 before the Common Era. In the palace city of Pella, beneath the shadow of Mount Olympus, where the ancient gods were said to watch the fates of mortals, a child is born, a prince destined for greatness and ruin in equal measure. His mother, Olympias, a proud and intense queen, believes her son is touched by divine favor. His father, King Philip II, sees in him a future worthy of his growing empire. They name him Alexander. Macedonia is not the refined Greece of marble temples and philosophers. It is a land of open skies and mountain winds. A place where Greek thought meets the grit of frontier life. The palace at Pella stands sturdy, rather than elegant. Its courtyards filled with the sounds of soldiers training, horses stamping, and the clang of iron. Beyond its walls stretch fields and vineyards, scattered villages, and the ever-present rhythm of labor and survival. Young Alexander is born into this world of strength and uncertainty. A kingdom still shaping itself, a people bound by loyalty and ambition. His father, Philip, is a man unlike any king before him. Through brilliance and determination, he has turned Macedonia from a scattered realm into the most formidable military power in Greece. His soldiers march in tight formation, their sarissas, spears twice the length of any other, bristling like the quills of a giant iron beast. He has conquered rivals, subdued rebellious cities, and united Greece under his command. Yet his greatest creation will not be the phalanx, nor even his kingdom. It will be his son, the restless, brilliant child watching from the shadows, already dreaming of something far greater than his father's crown. For now, though, Alexander is still only a boy. The fires of destiny are still distant, and the world remains vast and waiting. But young Alexander's mother, Olympias, was a figure of equal intensity, though of a different nature. She came from Epirus, a land to the west, and was said to be a devotee of ecstatic religious rites, a woman of fierce pride and unwavering devotion to her son. The palace whispered that she kept serpents as sacred creatures, that she communed with mysteries and prophecies. Whether truth or court gossip, these stories painted Olympias as a formidable presence, protective and demanding. Imagine the young Alexander growing in such a household. Picture a small boy with golden hair, said to have eyes of different colors, one darker than the other, observant and keen. Picture him walking the columned halls of the palace, where guards stood at attention and servants moved quietly about their duties. Picture him listening to the conversations of warriors and statesmen, learning early that the world was a place of power and politics, of alliances forged and broken. Philip, though often away on campaign, ensured his son received an education befitting a future king. Alexander learned to ride almost as soon as he could walk, growing comfortable on horseback, that essential skill for a Macedonian nobleman. He practiced with weapons, feeling the weight of a small sword in his young hands, learning the discipline and focus required of a warrior. But Philip wanted more for his heir than martial prowess alone. He wanted Alexander to have what he himself had lacked, a truly Greek education, steeped in philosophy and literature, in the arts of rhetoric and reason. And so, when Alexander was 13 years old, Philip made a decision that would shape not only his son, but the future of the known world. He invited Aristotle, one of the greatest minds of the age, to become Alexander's tutor. Part 2. The student of Aristotle. Picture now a grove of trees beside a clear stream, somewhere in the Macedonian countryside. Here, in a place called Mysa, away from the distractions of court, a small school was established. Here, the teenage Alexander and a handful of carefully selected companions would spend 3 years learning from one of history's most influential philosophers. Aristotle was then in his early 40s, already renowned as a former student of Plato and a thinker of extraordinary breadth. He had studied at the academy in Athens for 20 years before returning to Macedonia, and he brought with him a mind that encompassed everything from logic and ethics to biology and politics, from poetry to the natural sciences. Imagine the scene: morning light filtering through leaves, the sound of birds in the branches above, the cool grass beneath their feet. Aristotle, perhaps seated on a simple stone bench, speaking in measured tones about the nature of virtue, about the golden mean between extremes, about what makes a life well lived. And Alexander, intense and curious, asking questions, challenging ideas, absorbing knowledge with the hunger that would characterize his entire life. They read Homer together, those ancient epics that every Greek child knew. The Iliad especially captured Alexander's imagination, the story of Achilles and the Trojan War, of glory won and death defied, if only in memory and song. Aristotle gave Alexander a copy of the Iliad, annotated by the philosopher's own hand, and Alexander would carry this treasured text with him for the rest of his life, keeping it in a precious casket alongside his dagger even on campaign. But the education extended far beyond poetry. Aristotle taught geography and biology, explaining the natural world with careful observation and logical deduction. He taught medicine, that practical art so valuable to a king who would lead men into battle. He taught politics and ethics, exploring the nature of justice and governance, the proper relationship between ruler and ruled, the characteristics of different forms of government. Alexander learned rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, essential for commanding armies and swaying councils. He learned about other cultures, other peoples, gaining an appreciation for the vast diversity of human civilization beyond Macedonia's borders. Some historians suggest this early exposure to Aristotle's teachings about the interconnectedness of humanity may have influenced Alexander's later policies of cultural fusion, though others debate how much the student truly internalized the master's more cautious views on foreign peoples. Under Aristotle's guidance, Alexander developed a lifelong love of knowledge. He would later send specimens of plants and animals back to his former teacher from distant lands, contributing to Aristotle's natural histories. He would found cities with great libraries. He would surround himself with historians and philosophers, geographers and engineers, making his court a center of learning as well as power. Picture these years at Mysa as gentle ones, relatively speaking, a brief pause before the storm of history. Young men studying together, forming bonds of friendship that would last through years of campaigning. Among Alexander's companions in these studies were Hephaestion, who would become his closest friend and most trusted general, Ptolemy, who would one day rule Egypt, Cassander, Nerkes, and others who would play significant roles in the wars to come. The stream flowed past. The seasons turned. Summer heat gave way to autumn's cooling breath, then winter's chill, then spring's renewal, 3 times over. And Alexander grew from boy to young man. His mind sharpened. His character formed, though still untested by the crucible of power and war. Part 3. The Taming of Bucephalus. There is a story from these years, perhaps slightly earlier, that reveals something essential about the young Alexander's nature. It concerns a horse, a magnificent black stallion with a white star upon its forehead, brought to King Philip as a potential war horse. The animal was powerful, spirited, and completely unmanageable. Trainer after trainer attempted to handle the beast, and each was thrown or forced to retreat before its rearing, wild behavior. Philip was ready to send the horse away, declaring it too savage to be of use. But Alexander, perhaps 12 or 13 years old at the time, spoke up. He wagered that he could tame the horse, offering to pay its considerable price himself if he failed. Picture the scene in the palace courtyard. Guards and courtiers gathered to watch. The black stallion, muscles taut, eyes rolling, fighting against those who held its reins. And the young prince, walking forward with determination. What Alexander had noticed, what others had missed, was that the horse was frightened by its own shadow. Each time it moved, the dark shape on the ground moved too, startling it into panic. So Alexander took the reins and gently turned the animal to face the sun, where it could not see its shadow. He stroked its neck, speaking softly, calming it with voice and touch. Then smoothly he mounted and let the horse run, giving it space to release its energy in long, powerful strides across the training grounds. When Alexander finally returned, the horse calm beneath him, Philip is said to have wept with pride, declaring that his son must seek a kingdom worthy of his abilities. For Macedonia would be too small to contain such a spirit. The horse's name was Bucephalus, meaning ox-headed, perhaps for its broad forehead or powerful build. For the next 18 years, through countless battles and thousands of miles, Bucephalus would carry Alexander across the ancient world. The most famous horse in history, loyal unto death. This story, whether exact in all its details or slightly embellished by admiring historians, captures something true. Alexander's ability to observe carefully, to understand the root of a problem, to act with courage and conviction. These qualities, honed in youth, would serve him throughout his life. Part 4. The Battle of Chaeronea. The peaceful years of Alexander's youth were drawing to a close. In the south, the city-states of Greece, proud, independent, and fractious, began to stir once more. Athens, Thebes, and their allies looked north with alarm. Macedonia's growing power, forged by King Philip's reforms, threatened the delicate balance that had endured since the days of Sparta and Athens. It was the year 338 before the Common Era, when the long tension finally broke. Near a small Boeotian town called Chaeronea, 2 great armies gathered, one to defend the idea of Greek freedom, the other to unite Greece beneath a single crown. For Alexander, just 18 years old, it would be the first true test of everything he had learned, from philosophy to warfare. Philip entrusted him with command of the left wing, a position of both trust and danger. At his side rode the companion cavalry, an elite corps of horsemen, nobles, and veterans bound by loyalty and pride. They were the strike force of the Macedonian army. Swift, disciplined, devastating. Their armor gleamed in the morning sun. Their lances, called siston, caught the light like threads of gold. Dawn broke over the plain. The air was cool and heavy, with the scent of trampled grass and river mist. Across the field, the Greek alliance stood ready, ranks of hoplites in tight formation, bronze shields flashing, their long spears braced for the charge. In the center, the Athenian phalanx, proud heirs of Marathon. To their side, the Theban sacred band, 300 men who had never known defeat, lovers, brothers in arms, bound by honor and devotion. The field fell quiet, save for the steady beat of war drums. Then Philip gave the signal. On the Macedonian right, he advanced, slowly, deliberately, his famous phalanx moving like a living machine, its forest of sarissas driving forward step by measured step. Then, at a precise moment, he ordered a retreat, not from fear, but by design. The Athenians, seeing the enemy fall back, surged forward in triumph, breaking their own line in the rush. That was the trap. Across the field, Alexander saw the gap open, the smallest fracture, but enough. He raised his spear, shouted the order, and led his companions in a thunderous charge. Horses screamed. Hooves struck earth, bronze met bronze. The left wing slammed into the exposed flank of the Thebans with a force that shook the ground. The sacred band held for a moment. Their line rippled, then tightened again, their discipline unbroken. They fought shoulder to shoulder, refusing to yield even as the Macedonian cavalry circled and pressed from all sides. Alexander drove forward again, spear leveled, his cloak streaming in the wind. At his command, the companions wheeled in perfect formation, striking once more at the weakened flank. The phalanx, recovering from its feigned retreat, surged forward too, closing the trap. The Thebans were surrounded. They fought where they stood, every man to the last. When the sun finally set over Chaeronea, the sacred band lay fallen in their ranks, their shields overlapping like scales of bronze. Philip wept when he saw them, the chronicles say. Though they were enemies, their courage stirred something in him, a warrior's respect for warriors. For Alexander, the victory was more than a battle won. It was a glimpse of destiny, a lesson in timing, command, and the balance between courage and control. He had stood beside his father in the heart of the storm and proven himself worthy of kingship. The Greek world lay silent now, its power broken, its pride bowed. From that day forward, Macedonia was master of Greece. But for Alexander, Chaeronea was only the beginning. The victory at Chaeronea effectively ended Greek resistance to Macedonian power. Philip became the hegemon of Greece, uniting the fractious city-states under his leadership through a league known as the Corinthian League. He proclaimed a great campaign to come, an invasion of the Persian Empire, a crusade of vengeance for Xerxes' invasion of Greece 150 years earlier. For Alexander, Chaeronea was a transformative moment. He had proven himself in the most demanding test imaginable, had led men in battle and emerged victorious. He was no longer merely a prince and student, but a warrior and commander in his own right. Yet even as these triumphs unfolded, tensions grew within the royal family. Philip took another wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman, and Olympia saw this as a threat to Alexander's position as heir. At the wedding feast, words were exchanged, insults hurled, and Alexander briefly went into exile with his mother before a reconciliation was arranged. The palace politics remained complicated, fraught with suspicion and ambition. Part 5. The assassination of Philip. In the summer of 336 BCE, preparations for the Persian campaign were well advanced. Ships gathered at the coasts. Advance forces had already crossed into Asia Minor. Philip was at the height of his power, having achieved what no Macedonian king before him had accomplished: the unification of Greece and the position to challenge the mightiest empire in the known world. It was during the celebration of his daughter's wedding, in the ancient Macedonian capital of Aegae, that Philip's life came to a sudden and shocking end. Picture the festival atmosphere, the gathering of nobility from across the kingdom and beyond, the processions and ceremonies, music and feasting. Picture Philip entering the theater, confident, surrounded by his guards and companions, acknowledging the crowds. And then, suddenly, chaos. A member of Philip's own bodyguard, a man named Pausanias, rushed forward and stabbed the king. Philip fell, dying almost instantly. His assassin fled, but was caught and killed as he attempted to escape. The motives remain debated even now, lost in the shadows of ancient palace intrigue. Was Pausanias acting from personal grievance, as some sources claim? Was there a broader conspiracy? Were other members of the court involved? The historical record offers theories but no certain answers. What is certain is that in that single violent moment, everything changed. The great Persian campaign hung in balance. Macedonia's unity, so carefully constructed by Philip over decades, was suddenly threatened. And Alexander, 20 years old, found himself thrust onto the throne far sooner than anyone had anticipated. Part 6. A Young King's Challenges. The first months of Alexander's reign tested him as severely as any battle would. He was young, untried as a monarch, and immediately faced threats from multiple directions. Within Macedonia itself, rival claimants to the throne emerged, supported by various factions who thought to take advantage of the transition of power. Alexander moved swiftly and ruthlessly, eliminating potential challengers with a decisiveness that shocked some and reassured others. He had learned well from his father that mercy, however admirable in principle, could be fatal to a king without a secure throne. Beyond Macedonia's borders, the news of Philip's death was seen as opportunity by those who resented Macedonian dominance. To the north, Thracian and Illyrian tribes that Philip had subdued began to stir, testing whether the young king could hold his father's conquests. To the south, the Greek city-states, particularly Thebes and Athens, began to debate whether the Corinthian League and its obligations to Macedonia should be honored or cast aside. Imagine Alexander in these months, working day and night, holding councils with his generals, sending messengers in all directions, making decisions that would determine not only his own fate, but that of his kingdom. The weight of the crown settled on his shoulders, heavy as bronze armor, and he could not falter or show weakness. His first major campaign as king was northward, into Thrace and beyond, into lands of forests and mountains, where tribal warriors knew the terrain and how to use it. Alexander led his army with speed and skill, crushing rebellions before they could consolidate, crossing the Danube River to strike at tribes gathering on its far banks. The campaigns were swift and successful, demonstrating that the new king possessed his father's military genius and perhaps something more, a daring willingness to take risks that Philip might have avoided. But it was in Greece that Alexander faced his most serious early test. While he campaigned in the north, word spread through the Greek cities that he had been killed in battle. Thebes, emboldened by this rumor, rose in open revolt, besieging the Macedonian garrison left in the city's citadel. Athens debated joining them. Other cities watched and waited to see which way the wind would blow. Alexander's response was characteristically swift. He marched his army south with such speed that he appeared before Thebes while the city was still preparing for a siege, still believing him dead or distant. The Thebans, rather than surrender, chose to fight. Part 7. The Fall of Thebes. The year is 335 before the Common Era, and autumn has come to Greece. Across the hills of Boeotia, the leaves have turned to gold. Beneath them, the army of Alexander of Macedon encircles the proud city of Thebes. The Macedonian camp sprawls across the countryside. Thousands of tents, the gleam of armor under fading sunlight, the soft snort of horses tethered in long rows. Cooking fires send slow spirals of smoke into the evening sky. The air smells of ash, leather, and damp earth. Thebes has defied its king. Once a leader among the Greek cities, it has risen in rebellion, believing the young ruler of Macedon to be distracted in the north, or too inexperienced to strike back. But Alexander is here, faster than rumor, relentless as thunder. He has offered terms. Surrender those who led the revolt, and the city will be spared. Yet Thebes is proud, its walls ancient, its warriors descended from heroes of myth. The city refuses. For a day, the standoff holds. Silence between two armies, broken only by the calls of sentries and the rattle of distant armor. Then, as dawn breaks pale and cold, the assault begins. The Macedonian phalanx advances first, a wall of bronze and ashwood, their long sarissas bristling like reeds in the wind. Siega engines roll forward, their wooden frames groaning. Arrows whistle through the air, striking shields, walls, flesh. The Thebans fight with desperate valor. From the towers, they hurl stones, burning oil, anything that will slow the invaders. For hours the battle sways at the gates. Shouts, smoke, dust rising in choking clouds. But Macedonian discipline, honed by Philip and hardened under Alexander, cannot be held back forever. When the line breaks, it breaks all at once. The Macedonian infantry surges through the breach. Timpanian cavalry pours in behind them, cutting through the narrow streets like a tide of iron. What follows is not a battle, but a ruin. The city falls street by street, house by house. The cries of the defenders fade into the roar of conquest. Alexander stands at the heart of it all, a young king witnessing the destruction of a city older than his own nation. Some say he was enraged by the rebellion, others that he calculated the punishment carefully, that he meant for Thebes to serve as a warning to the rest of Greece. Perhaps both are true. When the fighting ends, the silence that follows is heavy and endless. 6,000 Thebans lie dead. The rest are taken into slavery, all but the priests, the sacred places, and those connected to certain honored families. The city's buildings are pulled down stone by stone. Thebes, the once mighty rival of Sparta and Athens, is erased from the map. Yet even in this devastation, small glimpses of Alexander's contradictions appear. He orders that the house of Pindar, the great lyric poet of Greece, be spared, a gesture of reverence for art and culture amid destruction. He spares the priests and the temples, unwilling to anger the gods. Some say he wept later for what had been done, that the memory of Thebes haunted him, a scar on his conscience he would never fully forget. History remembers the fall of Thebes as both victory and tragedy. For Alexander, it was the moment the world learned that mercy and wrath would walk side by side in his shadow. The effect on the rest of Greece was immediate and profound. Athens, which had been considering supporting Thebes, hastily sent envoys offering submission and congratulations. Every other city-state reaffirmed their oaths to the Corinthian League. No one would challenge Alexander's authority again during his lifetime. With Greece secured and his northern borders pacified, Alexander could finally turn his attention to the great project his father had planned, the invasion of Persia, the campaign that would transform a young Macedonian king into a legend that would echo across millennia. Part 8. Crossing the Hellespont. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander stood on the European shore of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia, looking across the blue waters toward the distant coast of Asia Minor. Behind him stretched his army, approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a force smaller than might be expected for an invasion of the world's greatest empire, but disciplined, experienced, and burning with ambition. The crossing was laden with symbolism. Alexander was aware of himself as a figure in history, following in the footsteps of heroes. The first ship that reached the Asian shore was his own. He threw his spear into the beach, claiming Asia as Spear One territory. He made sacrifices to the gods. And he visited Troy, the legendary city of Homer's epics, and paid homage at the tomb, said to be that of Achilles, his hero from childhood, running naked around the monument in the ancient Greek fashion, placing wreaths on the grave, declaring that Achilles was blessed to have had Homer as the herald of his glory. Picture Alexander at Troy, standing among ruins that were already ancient, connecting himself to a mythic past, seeing his own campaign as a continuation of legendary glory. This was not merely strategy or conquest to him, but destiny, a fate written in the stars and in the old stories that had shaped his imagination. The Persian Empire was then ruled by Darius III, a relatively recent king who had inherited a vast realm stretching from the Mediterranean to India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Egypt. It was a complex, sophisticated civilization with centuries of tradition, professional armies, immense wealth, and administrative systems that governed dozens of different peoples and cultures. The Persian response to Alexander's invasion was initially measured. They assumed, perhaps reasonably, that this was another raid, similar to the advance force that Philip had sent earlier. The regional governors, called satraps, gathered their forces. Persian cavalry, Greek mercenary infantry in Persian service, and various local troops. The armies met near the Granicus River in early summer. Part 9. The Battle of the Granicus. It was May of 334 before the Common Era, when Alexander met the armies of Persia for the first time. The river was called the Granicus, a winding current that cut through the plains of northwestern Asia Minor. Shallow in places, swift in others, its banks steep and slippery with spring rain. On the far side the Persian cavalry waited, proud, confident, resplendent in polished armor that caught the light of the setting sun. Their banners fluttered in the warm evening breeze. Behind them, the ground rose gently into the hills, giving them the high ground and the advantage. Alexander's generals counseled caution. The river was treacherous, the enemy position strong. They urged him to wait for morning, to find a calmer ford, to cross under better conditions. But waiting was not in Alexander's nature. Delay, he feared, would invite more Persian troops, more defenses, and, worse, would dull the edge of momentum that had carried his men from Macedon to this distant shore. He decided to attack immediately. Picture the scene as the day's light begins to fade. Two armies staring across the glimmering water, silence stretching between them. On the near bank, the Macedonian phalanx stands ready, rows of long sarissas like reeds against the sky. On the right wing, the companion cavalry, under Alexander's personal command, waits for the signal, horses pawing at the ground, nostrils steaming in the cool air. Then, without warning, the king spurs his horse forward. Alexander himself plunges into the river, the first to cross, spray and sunlight flashing around him. His men follow, hundreds of horsemen riding into the torrent, the current battering against their armor, the hooves of their mounts churning mud and foam. The Persians, momentarily stunned by the audacity, recover and charge down the opposite slope to meet them. The two forces collide in the water, bronze against bronze, hooves striking, shouts echoing across the plain. The current becomes a chaos of men and horses, foam stained red with battle. Alexander's plumed helmet marks him clearly amid the tumult. He leads from the front, shouting orders, urging his companions onward. Persian nobles recognize him instantly and rush toward him, eager to end the invasion at its source. Blades flash. One blow splits his helmet. Another strikes his shoulder. A Persian nobleman raises his sword for the killing stroke, but in that instant, Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's closest companions, rides between them and cuts the man down, saving the king's life. With renewed fury, the Macedonians press forward. The phalanx surges across the river, the forest of sarissas locking into its deadly rhythm. Step by step, shield by shield, they force the Persians back up the bank. The Persian cavalry, though brave, cannot withstand the weight of Macedonian discipline. Their lines waver, then break. In moments, what began as a confident defense dissolves into retreat. On the far bank, under the fading light, the Macedonian banners rise victorious. The cost is heavy, but the message is clear. The Persians have been defeated on their own soil. For Alexander, it is more than a victory. It is a declaration, to his men, to his enemies, to history itself, that the invasion of Asia has truly begun. Yet his triumph is not without shadows. Among the Persian dead are Greek mercenaries, men who had once fought for their own city-states, but now served the great king of Persia. Alexander orders them cut down without mercy, declaring that no Greek should fight against Greece. It is a harsh lesson, and one that will echo in his later campaigns. In the days that follow, the cities of Asia Minor begin to open their gates. Some greet him as a liberator, others surrender out of fear or inevitability. He moves south along the coast, methodically seizing harbors and fortresses, denying Persia's powerful navy the ports it needs. Wherever he goes, he proclaims himself the champion of Greek freedom, a phrase that inspires some and reassures others, even as they quietly realize that Macedonian freedom and Greek freedom are not quite the same. Still, the campaign has begun, and there is no turning back. The Granicus is behind him now, its waters running quietly again, as if nothing had happened. Ahead lies the heart of the Persian Empire, and destiny waiting beyond the horizon. Part 10. The Gordian Knot. As Alexander moved inland into Anatolia, he came to the city of Gordium, an ancient Phrygian capital. Here there was preserved a wagon, sacred and ancient, its yoke tied to a pole with a knot of such complexity that no one could find where it began or ended. Legend held that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would rule all of Asia. Alexander examined the knot, this puzzle that had defeated everyone who attempted it. Various accounts describe what happened next. Some say he cleverly removed the pin that held the yoke, and thus freed it without untying the knot proper, technically fulfilling the prophecy through lateral thinking. Others say he simply drew his sword and cut through it in one stroke, declaring that it made no difference how it was undone. Whether historical fact or later embellishment, the story of the Gordian knot became symbolic of Alexander's approach to seemingly impossible problems. Direct, bold, refusing to be bound by traditional limitation. And the prophecy that whoever loosed it would rule Asia must have resonated deeply with his ambitions. The campaign continued. Seasons turned. Alexander moved his army through the Anatolian plateau, through regions of stunning natural beauty, mountain passes where eagles soared, river valleys lush with vegetation, plains stretching to distant horizons. He was not merely conquering territory, but beginning to engage with the vast cultural diversity of the Persian Empire, encountering peoples with different languages, customs, and traditions from anything in his Greek experience. All the while, King Darius in distant Babylon was receiving reports of the Macedonian advance with increasing alarm. The loss at the Granicus could be seen as a frontier skirmish, but Alexander was not retreating. He was pushing deeper into the empire, threatening key regions. Darius began gathering his forces, calling up armies from across his vast domain, preparing to personally lead them against this dangerous young invader. Part 11. The Battle of Issus. The year is 333 before the Common Era. 2 years have passed since Alexander first crossed into Asia. Now, in the cool winds of November, the armies of Macedonia and Persia meet again, this time near the coastal town of Issus, where the mountains of Cilicia press close against the sea. It is a narrow land, a bottleneck between water and stone. To the east, the black line of the mountains. To the west, the glinting curve of the Mediterranean. Between them, only a few miles of flat ground, hemmed in by the river Pinarus that runs cold and shallow toward the sea. Here, fate has chosen the place where east and west will collide. On one side stands Darius III, the great king of Persia, heir to 2 centuries of empire, master of lands stretching from Egypt to the Indus. His camp stretches across the plain like a city of silk and bronze. Thousands of fires burn through the night. The air is thick with the scent of horses and oil, incense and fear. His army is vast, a mosaic of nations, Persian cavalry in gleaming armor, Greek mercenaries drilled in the phalanx, archers from the east, spearmen from the high plateaus, contingents from every corner of his realm. Somewhere in that sea of tents, Darius himself prays to Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Light, asking for victory over the young Macedonian king who dares to challenge the empire of kings. On the other side of the field, Alexander's camp is smaller, quieter, ordered. His men are veterans now, scarred, sun-browned, lean with discipline. They have marched thousands of miles, fought dozens of battles, and know by heart the sound of his voice. Around their fires that night, there is little doubt. They have followed him into every storm, and they will follow him again tomorrow. As dawn breaks, the narrow valley fills with the glitter of armor. The Persian host forms in long shimmering ranks, cavalry on the flanks, Greek mercenaries in the center. Behind them, the chariot of Darius gleams like a moving altar, draped in royal colors, its wheels edged with bronze. Across the river, the Macedonians assemble, fewer in number, but arranged with the precision of a craftsman's hand. The phalanx forms the center, shields overlapping, spears angled forward. On the right, Alexander himself takes position with the companion cavalry, his helmet crowned with a white plume, his horse Bucephalus restless beneath him. The wind shifts. Alexander raises his arm, and the trumpets sound. The Macedonian line surges forward, splashing into the cold waters of the Pinaris. Arrows whistle overhead. The current tugs at their legs, but they press on, shouting, charging, climbing the opposite bank into the teeth of the Persian defense. Alexander leads from the front as always, driving his companions hard into the Persian left. The impact is thunderous. Horse against horse, spear against shield, a shock that reverberates through the entire line. The Persian cavalry buckles, reforms, then shatters beneath the relentless pressure of the charge. And there at the center of the Persian host stands Darius, visible in his chariot, surrounded by bodyguards, banners snapping in the wind. Alexander sees him. He lowers his spear and drives toward that point like a man possessed. The fighting around the royal chariot is desperate, confused. Macedonian and Persian bodyguards locked in close combat, dust and cries swirling around the heart of the battlefield. For a moment, the fate of empires hangs in the balance. Then, as suddenly as a storm breaks, it happens. Darius' chariot turns. Whether through panic or the chaos of wounded horses, or a calculated decision to save the great king's life, the royal banner wheels and flees the field. Word spreads like fire through the Persian ranks. Confusion, disbelief, and then collapse. The great army of the East dissolves into chaos, men shouting, running, tripping over one another in the crush to escape. Even the Greek mercenaries who moments before had broken through a portion of the Macedonian line falter as the command structure evaporates. The battle becomes a rout. By sunset, the field of Issus belongs to Alexander. The Persian dead lie thick along the banks of the river. The survivors scatter into the hills. The Macedonians enter the royal camp, a world of unimaginable luxury. Silks, gold, and treasures from every corner of the empire. And within the largest tent of all, they find the family of Darius himself. His mother, his wife, his children, left behind in the confidence of certain victory. Alexander orders that they be treated with dignity, assuring them that their royal titles remain, that they are not prisoners, but guests. It is one of the moments that define his legend. Conqueror and gentleman, ruthless in war, yet capable of extraordinary restraint. The victory at Issus is complete. The great king has fled. The Persian Empire is shaken. And for the first time, the world begins to understand that this young Macedonian, barely 23 years old, is not merely a warrior. He is something greater. Alexander's treatment of these captives revealed aspects of his character that would recur throughout his conquests. He treated them with extraordinary courtesy and respect, ensuring they retained their royal dignity, that they suffered no harm or insult, that they lacked for nothing appropriate to their station. When he came into their presence, Darius's mother allegedly mistook the taller Hephaestion for Alexander and prostrated herself before him, only to be gently corrected. Alexander reportedly said, "You were not mistaken, mother, for he too is Alexander," acknowledging his friend's importance and easing her embarrassment. This magnanimity toward the Persian royal family was strategic, certainly, showing that Alexander could be generous to those who surrendered. But it also reflected his growing vision of himself, not merely as a conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler of a vast, diverse empire, someone who could bridge Greek and Persian worlds. Part 12. The Siege of Tyre. After the thunder of Issus faded, Alexander did not march east in pursuit of Darius. Not yet. He had learned from his father that victory on land meant little if the sea remained in enemy hands. And so, he turned south, along the coastlines of Phoenicia, determined to cut the Persian fleet off from every safe harbor. That path led him to Tyre. Tyre was no ordinary city. It was ancient when Alexander was born. The jewel of the Phoenicians, masters of the sea, traders who had once sailed as far as Spain and beyond. But more than that, Tyre was proud. Its heart lay on an island half a mile from shore, a fortress of stone rising straight out of the waves, surrounded on all sides by the Mediterranean's shifting blue. For centuries, that island had defied conquerors. Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had besieged it for 13 years and failed to take it. The Tyrians believed, not without reason, that they could never fall. So when Alexander sent word demanding entry to the city, to sacrifice at the temple of Heracles, whom the Greeks equated with the Phoenician god Melkart, the Tyrians refused. They would not allow a foreign king, no matter how victorious, to cross their waters and stand within their sacred walls. And so began one of the most extraordinary sieges in all of history. Alexander looked out across the narrow strip of sea that separated the island from the mainland. Half a mile of deep open water. To most commanders, it was an impossible barrier. But Alexander saw only a challenge. He would build a bridge where none had ever been, a causeway, a mole of stone and timber that would stretch from the shore to the city's gates. Imagine this scene. Thousands of men at work day after day beneath the Phoenician sun, laborers hauling boulders from the hills, rolling them on wooden sledges to the shore, engineers sinking piles, laying timbers, pouring earth and rubble into the gaps. Slowly, painfully, the land itself seemed to grow outward into the sea. The Tyrians watched from their high walls, amused at first, confident that the waves and their ships would make quick work of such folly. Their war galleys darted in close to the causeway, showering the workers with arrows, hurling flaming pitch and stones from catapults. The sea itself seemed to turn against the Macedonians. Storms tore apart the early sections, dragging the half-built mole back into the waves. But Alexander did not relent. He rebuilt. He innovated. He ordered the construction of massive siege towers, built atop the growing causeway. Wooden giants covered in hides soaked with vinegar to resist fire. From their heights, catapults hurled stones and bolts back toward the city walls, driving off the Tyrian ships long enough for the work to continue. Yet the defenders were clever. In a daring night raid, they filled an old transport ship with combustible materials, pitch, sulfur, torches, set it ablaze, and drove it straight into the Macedonian towers. Flames leapt high into the dark. The towers burned. The workers fled. The sea glowed with reflected fire. The next morning, Alexander was already rebuilding. He summoned ships from every Phoenician port that had surrendered. Byblos, Sidon, Aradus, and forged his own fleet. The blockade tightened. The island grew isolated. Tyre's own allies began to fall silent. Month after month, the causeway crept closer to the island's walls. Each foot gained was paid for in blood, sweat, and the bones of men and animals alike. The sound of hammers and creaking timbers became the rhythm of the siege, the heartbeat of an empire's will. By midsummer, July of 332 BCE, the causeway reached the city. Siege engines rolled forward. The fleet joined the assault by sea. Macedonian rams crashed against the walls. Catapults hurled stones the size of men. The Tyrians fought with desperate courage, but the walls that had stood for centuries began to crumble. When the breach finally opened, Alexander's men surged through from land and sea alike. Fighting inside the city was brutal, house to house, street to street. 8,000 Tyrians died. Thousands more were captured and sold into slavery. The king of Tyre was spared, perhaps out of admiration, perhaps out of calculation. But the city that had defied empires was broken. Alexander ordered a sacrifice to Heracles in the temple at last, the act he had demanded 7 months before, but now as master, not supplicant. The causeway he built never disappeared. Over the centuries it gathered sand, silt, and debris until the island of Tyre became part of the mainland. Even today, 2,000 years later, that strip of land remains a permanent scar of Alexander's will upon the earth. With Tyre fallen, the eastern Mediterranean lay open. The Persian fleet, denied its harbors, withered into impotence. The sea itself had surrendered to the king of Macedon, and Alexander turned his gaze eastward again, toward Egypt, and the next chapter of his legend. Part 13. Egypt, the land of ancient wisdom. From the burning coasts of Phoenicia, Alexander turned his armies south, toward the land that the Greeks had always spoken of in reverent tones. Egypt, for the Macedonians, it was like stepping into myth. The Nile Valley, cradle of civilization, where stone monuments older than memory rose from the desert sands. Pyramids that had stood for 2,000 years before Homer ever sang. Temples whose walls were carved with the language of gods. Egypt was not a battlefield waiting to happen. It was a civilization waiting to be understood. When Alexander crossed the Sinai and entered the delta in the autumn of 332 BCE, the Persian satraps offered little resistance. After centuries under foreign rule, many Egyptians welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a deliverer, a young king who spoke of liberation rather than domination. The gates of Memphis opened without a fight. In that ancient city, where the sacred bull Apis was worshipped as a living god, Alexander entered the great temple, laid offerings upon the altar, and performed the rituals of the pharaohs, not as an act of vanity, but of respect. The priests watched closely, testing whether this foreign ruler would honor their traditions. When he did, they proclaimed what few outsiders had ever been granted. Alexander was now pharaoh of Egypt, chosen of the gods, son of Amun, lord of the two lands. For the first time, perhaps, the idea of divine destiny ceased to be a story told about him, and became something he began to believe. Yet it was not only ritual that occupied him here. Standing on the shore, where the Nile meets the Mediterranean, Alexander looked out across the waves and saw the shape of a new vision. There, between the sea and the lake of Meroeotis, lay a stretch of land framed by a natural harbor, and the island of Pharos beyond. He saw it not as it was, bare and windswept, but as it could be, a city of marble and trade, a crossroads of empire, a place where Greek thought and Egyptian wisdom might meet and flourish. Kneeling on the sand, he traced the outline of the city with barley meal, the shape of streets, of walls, of temples and markets yet to come. Alexandria, the name itself, carried a promise of permanence, of legacy. Others would build it, expand it, adorn it with wonders he would never live to see. The lighthouse of Pharos, its fire burning across the night sea. The library, whose scrolls would one day contain the knowledge of the world. But even now, in its infancy, the idea of Alexandria marked a turning point. It was more than a city. It was a philosophy that Greek reason and Eastern spirituality could coexist, that the world could be one. And then from this newborn vision of peace, Alexander sought the divine once more. He set out across the desert, not with armies, but with a small retinue, heading west toward the oasis of Siwa, deep in the sands of the Libyan frontier. The journey took days under the merciless sun, the wind carrying the scent of salt and stone, the horizon shimmering with heat. There, in the solitude of the dunes, he came to the Oracle of Amun, a temple hidden among palms and pools of clear water. Part 14. The Oracle at Siwa. Picture the desert journey, the heat of day, the cold of night, the endless landscape of sand and stone, the Macedonian king and his small escort moving through an environment utterly foreign to their Greek experience. The Libyan desert stretched in all directions, beautiful in its severity, deadly in its emptiness. The oasis of Siwa, when it finally appeared, must have seemed miraculous. Date palms rising from the sand, pools of fresh water, the temple complex nestled in green abundance, surrounded by barren wastes. The priests of Amun received Alexander into the sanctuary. What transpired in the inner temple remains one of history's enduring mysteries. The priests addressed Alexander as son of Amun, which could have been merely formulaic, the traditional greeting for any pharaoh, or could have held deeper meaning. Ancient sources report that Alexander asked questions of the oracle and received answers that satisfied him greatly, but the specific questions and responses were kept private. Some historians suggest Alexander asked whether he had successfully avenged his father's murder, whether he was destined to rule the world, whether he was indeed divine in origin. Others suggest the entire episode has been mythologized beyond any historical certainty. What matters perhaps more than the literal truth is what Alexander believed, or at least what he allowed others to believe. That he had received divine confirmation of his destiny. That he was not merely king, but something more, touched by the gods themselves. This visit to Siwa marks a subtle but important shift in how Alexander presented himself. Among Greeks and Macedonians, claiming divinity was problematic, even dangerous, too reminiscent of Eastern despotism. But in Egypt, and increasingly in the eastern lands he would conquer, divine or semi-divine kingship was normal, expected, part of the traditional political and religious order. Alexander was learning to speak different languages of power to different audiences, to be Macedonian to Macedonians, Greek to Greeks, and Pharaoh to Egyptians. From Egypt, satisfied with arrangements he had made for the province's governance and his new city's foundation, Alexander turned east once more. Darius had not been idle during this time. The great king had gathered his forces, assembling the largest army yet, calling upon the vast resources of the Persian heartland. The decisive confrontation was approaching. Part 15. The Road to Gaugamela. The year 331 BCE found Alexander marching from Egypt back through Syria and Mesopotamia, moving toward the heart of the Persian Empire. His army had grown with reinforcements from Macedonia and Greece, but also increasingly included contingents from conquered territories, a more diverse force than the purely Macedonian and Greek army that had crossed the Hellespont 3 years earlier. Darius had positioned himself on a carefully chosen battlefield near the village of Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River, in the flat plains of northern Mesopotamia. The Persian king had learned from previous defeats. He had selected terrain that would favor his superior numbers and his cavalry, even having the ground leveled and smoothed to allow his prized scythe chariots to operate effectively. The Persian army assembled at Gaugamela represented the full might of the empire, perhaps 200,000 infantry and 40,000 cavalry by ancient estimates, though again modern historians suggest lower but still substantial numbers. There were the elite Persian and Median cavalry, the Greek mercenaries still fighting for Persian gold. Infantry from across the empire, war elephants from India, and those fearsome scythe chariots with blades extending from their wheels, designed to tear through enemy formations. As Alexander approached, his scouts reported the size and disposition of the enemy force. His generals, even the boldest, must have felt some trepidation. This was no longer a river crossing or a restricted battlefield. This was the open plain where Persian numbers could be fully deployed, where the great king had chosen his ground and prepared it carefully. The night before battle, Alexander is said to have slept soundly, so deeply that his attendants had difficulty waking him. Whether this reflected genuine confidence, exhaustion from the march, or the calm of a man who had accepted whatever fate would bring, it impressed his companions and soldiers. Parmenion, his most senior general, asked if he should attack the Persian camp during the night, but Alexander refused, saying he would not steal victory. Picture that night. 2 vast armies separated by darkness and a few miles of open ground. In the Persian camp, perhaps nervous energy, the knowledge that this was the empire's last great throw of the dice. In the Macedonian camp, veterans settling into the familiar routine before battle, checking equipment, speaking quietly, thinking of home or glory, or simply the sunrise to come. Part 16. The Battle of Gaugamela. Dawn came on October 1st, 331 BCE, illuminating the plain of Gaugamela, a flat expanse that would witness one of history's most decisive battles. As the two armies took their positions, the vast scale of the Persian force became fully apparent to the Macedonians. The Persian line extended far beyond Alexander's on both flanks, threatening to envelop the smaller army. The sun rose slow and red over the plain of Gaugamela, painting the horizon in bands of gold and dust. The ground stretched flat and featureless for miles, a landscape chosen by Darius III himself, broad enough to deploy the vast Persian host that now waited, its banners fluttering like waves in a sea of armor. For Alexander, it was the final test. Before him stood the largest army he had ever faced, perhaps 200,000 strong, with elephants, chariots, cavalry from every corner of the empire. Behind him, a force a fraction that size, weary, loyal, unbreakable. The veterans of Issus and Tyre, hardened by years of conquest, drawn up now in quiet lines beneath the morning light. Imagine the stillness before battle, the murmured prayers, the clink of armor, the soft sound of horses shifting their weight. Alexander rode along the front, Bucephalus tossing his dark mane, the king's voice calm, his words simple. He told his men that beyond this field lay the world itself, that by nightfall they would either rule it or die upon it. The Macedonian formation began to move, not head-on, but at an angle, drifting to the right toward the Persian flank. Dust rose in pale clouds beneath their feet. To the Persians, the motion looked like hesitation, like confusion. But it was a trap in motion. Darius, anxious to keep his army aligned, mirrored the shift, stretching his own line thinner, exposing the center. And then the chariots came. Dozens of scythed chariots, their axles fitted with curved blades, meant to shred through men and horses alike, charged forward with a roar. The sun flashed on metal as they cut across the plain. But Alexander had anticipated it. The Macedonian light troops stepped aside, forming lanes. Archers and javelin men targeted the drivers. The chariots thundered through empty space, their momentum lost, their threat undone. When the last of them rattled to a halt, the field was littered with broken wood and fallen horses. The storm had passed, leaving the phalanx untouched. Then the real battle began. The Macedonian phalanx advanced, a living wall of bronze and iron, each man's sarissa angled forward like a forest of spears. The ground trembled beneath their synchronized tread. On both flanks, cavalry wheeled and clashed, the air filled with the sound of hooves and the cries of men fighting for their lives. Amid the chaos, Alexander watched. He saw what others could not, the slightest gap forming in the Persian line as their cavalry shifted to envelop his flanks. That was his moment. He spurred Bucephalus forward, leading the companion cavalry in a perfect wedge, a spear point of shining armor driving into the heart of the Persian army. They struck like thunder. The wedge broke through light infantry, scattered archers, crushed the center of the Persian line, straight toward the royal chariot of Darius himself. For the second time in his life, the great king saw the young Macedonian bearing down upon him. His guards fell one by one. Arrows whistled, swords flashed. The horses of Darius' chariot reared, screaming, blood in their manes. And once again, the great king turned and fled. In that moment, the heart of Persia broke. Command vanished. Orders stopped. Panic rippled outward like a wave through the vast army. But elsewhere on the field, the fight still raged. On the Macedonian left, Parmenian's troops were struggling under the weight of Persian cavalry that had swung around to attack the baggage train. Messengers rode through the dust, shouting for aid. For a time, victory hung in balance. The center triumphant, the flank in peril. Alexander had a choice: pursue Darius and end the war at once, or turn back to save his men. He chose his men. Wheeling his cavalry, he rode to the rescue, cutting into the Persian horsemen from behind, driving them back in confusion. The field, once a storm of movement, began to quiet as the last resistance crumbled. The enemy's courage, like their lines, dissolved with the setting sun. By nightfall, the plain of Gaugamela lay silent, the sand dark with shadow and blood. Tens of thousands of Persians lay where they had fallen. The empire of Darius, the power that had once humbled Greece, was finished. Alexander stood beneath the deepening sky, his armor streaked with dust and sweat, looking east, toward Babylon, toward Persepolis, toward the heart of the world now open before him. He was 25 years old. And in that moment, the course of history bent to his name. Part 17. The Taking of Babylon. After the dust of Gaugamela settled, Alexander's army turned south, following the course of the Tigris River toward the greatest prize of all, Babylon. To the ancient world, Babylon was more than a city. It was a legend made stone, the seat of kings, the navel of civilization, a name whispered in awe for nearly 2,000 years. Its ziggurats had inspired tales of the Tower of Babel. Its hanging gardens were said to defy the earth itself. Its scholars charted the motions of the heavens when much of the world still dreamed in myth. Now, at last, the gates of that immortal city opened to a conqueror from the distant mountains of Macedon. There was no siege, no resistance, no fire or ruin. The Persian satrap of Babylon came forth in procession, robes of white, hands extended, offering the keys of the city and gifts of submission. For all its splendor, Babylon understood survival. And Alexander, unlike so many conquerors before him, understood reverence. Picture the scene. The sun hanging low over the plain, the great double walls of Babylon casting long shadows. The Ishtar Gate, glazed in brilliant blue tiles, its surface alive with golden dragons and bulls that gleamed in the evening light. Through that gate rode Alexander. Behind him, his companions and phalanx, dusty, scarred, silent with awe. For him, a city built by dreamers. Broad avenues lined with palms. The Euphrates flowing between terraces and gardens. Temples to gods older than Greece, their spires rising toward the fading sky. In the temple of Marduk, the Babylonian lord of creation, Alexander offered sacrifice, as he had once done to Apis in Egypt and Amun in the desert of Siwa. He followed the local rites, bowed his head before the statue of the god, and the priests, seeing this foreign king honor their ways, proclaimed him chosen. For the people of Babylon, he was not a conqueror, he was a restoration. For Alexander was something else entirely. It was the first time he stood within the heart of the empire he had overthrown, and realized it now belonged to him. From Babylon, the march continued east to Susa, another capital of Persia, where the royal palaces glowed in polished stone and inlaid gold. The vaults of empire opened, 50,000 talents of gold and silver, enough to fund kingdoms for generations. Purple dye worth more than jewels. Sculptures, treasures, the accumulated wealth of centuries. The Macedonians, hardened by years of campaign, stood speechless before the sheer abundance. Alexander ordered that a portion be distributed among his soldiers, rewards for their loyalty. Another portion was sent back to Greece, gifts for temples and cities. The rest was retained, fuel for the empire still to come. But even among such magnificence, one name still lingered. One city remained untaken, one symbol unbroken. Persepolis, the soul of Persia, the seat of its kings, the fire at the center of its pride. And Alexander, now master of Babylon and Susa, turned his gaze toward it. He had entered the empire. Now he would bring it to its knees. Part 18. Persepolis, the heart of empire. Persepolis was different from Babylon or Susa. Those were administrative capitals, centers of government and trade. Persepolis was the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, the symbolic center of Persian power, built by Darius as a monument to Persian glory. The city lay in a remote valley in the Persian heartland, approached by a great ceremonial stairway carved with reliefs showing subject peoples, bringing tribute, processions of the immortal Persian guard, the great king receiving homage. The palace complex sprawled across a massive stone terrace. Audience halls with soaring columns, treasuries, residential quarters, all decorated with exquisite stone carvings and once painted in brilliant colors. The winter of 331 to 330 BCE found Alexander at the gates of Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire. The city lay quiet beneath the snow-dusted mountains of Parsa, its great stairways flanked by sculpted guardians, its halls carved with images of kings long gone. The defenders, knowing resistance was futile, opened the gates. There was no battle, The empire's soul simply passed from one hand to another. Within those walls lay wealth beyond imagining. 120,000 talents of gold and silver. So much that it took entire caravans of mules and camels to carry it away. The archives of 2 centuries of empire. Tablets of clay inscribed with royal decrees, lists of tribute, letters between satraps. Ivory carvings, woven tapestries, gemstones, and statues. The accumulated memory of Persia itself. For months, the Macedonian army lingered there among the palaces of kings. The great audience hall, the Apadana, stood supported by columns like forest trunks, their capitals shaped into bulls and lions. From its terraces, one could see the mountains fading into the haze, the roads stretching outward in every direction, the veins of an empire now claimed by a single man. And it was there, in that place of majesty and silence, that Alexander made a choice, or perhaps allowed a moment to make the choice for him. The stories differ, as they always do. Some say it began as an act of revenge, a deliberate mirror of Xerxes' burning of Athens, the final settling of a debt long unpaid. Others say it was the result of wine and weariness, a night of revelry where the courtesan Thais, her voice bright with laughter, urged the king to prove his victory with fire. Perhaps it was both, vengeance and vanity, politics and passion, mingled in the haze of drink and triumph. What is certain is this: the flames began in the royal palace, and once they started, they could not be stopped. Imagine the scene. The sound of music and laughter fading into confusion. Torches flung against cedar beams. The orange light spreading upward through the dark. Columns cracking in the heat. Gold melting into rivulets along the floors. The painted reliefs. The processions of kings. The emissaries from distant lands, disappearing behind a veil of smoke. Outside, soldiers watched from the terraces as the roofs of Persepolis glowed like a sunrise that would never end. Some cheered, others wept, and somewhere amid the flames, Alexander stood watching, silent, unmoving, as the palace of Darius and Xerxes, the very heart of the empire he had come to inherit, burned to ash. Whether in that moment or in the days that followed, regret began to take hold. Ancient sources speak of him returning to the ruins, walking among the blackened stones, realizing that in destroying Persia's past, he had also scarred his own future. The burning of Persepolis marked the end of one world and the uneasy birth of another. The empire of the Persians was finished. Darius still lived, fleeing eastward with what remained of his court. But his throne was gone, his gods silent. For Alexander, the question now changed. No longer how to conquer, but how to rule. No longer who to defeat, but what to become. The fires of Persepolis would burn in memory long after the ashes cooled, a reminder that even the greatest triumph can cast the longest shadow. Part 19. The Death of Darius. Alexander pursued Darius eastward through the spring and summer of 330 BCE, chasing the remnant of Persian royal authority through the provinces of Media and Parthia, into the harsh terrain of eastern Iran. The chase became increasingly desperate for the fugitive great king, his following dwindling, his authority evaporating. The Persian nobles, still with Darius, began to lose faith. Led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, they made a decision. They arrested Darius, binding him in golden chains, intending to use him as a bargaining chip with Alexander, or failing that, to claim power themselves in the eastern provinces. But, as Alexander's pursuit intensified, as Macedonian cavalry closed the distance, Bessus and his co-conspirators realized they could not escape with their royal prisoner. In July 330 BCE, somewhere in the wasteland between civilizations, they stabbed Darius and left him dying by the roadside before fleeing further east. Alexander arrived soon after. The accounts, perhaps embellished but poignant nonetheless, describe him finding Darius in his final moments, covering the dying king with his own cloak, expressing regret that they met in such circumstances. Darius allegedly thanked Alexander for his treatment of the Persian royal family, and died in the arms of a Macedonian soldier who could speak Persian. Whether the scene occurred exactly so hardly matters. What is historically significant is Alexander's response. He ordered Darius buried with full royal honors at Persepolis, in the tombs of his ancestors. He declared himself the legitimate successor to the Persian throne, not merely a foreign conqueror, but the rightful great king. He proclaimed Bessus and the other assassins to be traitors and regicides, criminals to be hunted down and punished. This position was extraordinary. Alexander was claiming not just to have defeated the Persian Empire, but to have become it, to have inherited its sovereignty, to be the legitimate ruler of all its territories and peoples. He would be both king of Macedon and great king of Persia, both Greek and Eastern monarch, bridging worlds that had been enemies for centuries. This vision would increasingly define the remaining years of his life, and create growing tensions with his Macedonian and Greek followers, who had not crossed into Asia to see their king become a Persian monarch. Part 20. Into the Eastern Satrapies. With Darius dead, and his claim to be the legitimate Persian successor proclaimed, Alexander turned to consolidating control over the vast eastern regions of the former empire. Bactria, Sogdiana, the territories, stretching toward the edges of the known world. These campaigns, from 330 to 327 BCE, were different in character from the great set-piece battles against Darius. This was guerrilla warfare in difficult terrain, mountain, and desert, against opponents who knew the land and used it brilliantly, who could disappear into the landscape and reappear where least expected. Bessus, the regicide, had proclaimed himself great king in Bactria. Alexander pursued him relentlessly through mountains and valleys, finally capturing him through a combination of military pressure and turning his own followers against him. The punishment was severe. Bessus was mutilated and executed in the traditional Persian manner for regicides, a harsh message that served both justice and political purpose. But the campaigns in Bactria and Sogdiana continued. The local population, fiercely independent, mounted determined resistance under leaders like Spitamenes, a brilliant guerrilla commander who frustrated Alexander's forces for 2 years. The fighting was bitter and difficult, small-scale engagements rather than grand battles, sieges of mountain fortresses thought impregnable, marches through terrain where no Greek had ever ventured. Picture Alexander during these years. No longer the young king proving himself, now approaching 30, hardened by continuous campaigning, bearing scars from multiple wounds. His beard had grown full, in the Eastern fashion. He was adapting Persian customs, wearing Persian dress on occasion, incorporating Persian nobles into his court and army, increasingly seeing himself as ruler of a universal empire rather than purely Macedonian king. These changes created friction with his Macedonian veterans. They had followed him to avenge Greek grievances against Persia, to plunder the wealth of the East, to win glory and return home. Instead, they found themselves fighting year after year in remote regions, watching their king adopt foreign customs, seeing Persians given positions of honor and authority. Murmurs of discontent grew. Part 21. The Pages' Conspiracy and Clitus. In 328 BCE, while campaigning in Sogdiana, Alexander faced a plot against his life by royal pages, young nobles serving in his court. The conspiracy was discovered and the plotters executed, but the incident revealed growing tensions. One of those implicated, though perhaps tangentially, was Callisthenes, the nephew of Aristotle, who served as official historian of the expedition. Callisthenes had been increasingly critical of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, particularly the practice of proskynesis, the formal prostration before the king that was standard Persian court protocol, but deeply offensive to Greek and Macedonian sensibilities, suggesting servitude inappropriate for free men. Alexander had attempted to introduce this practice at court, perhaps as a way of creating unified protocol that both Greek and Persian courtiers could follow. But it met resistance, and Callisthenes had been vocally opposed. After the pages' conspiracy, Callisthenes was arrested. He died in custody, whether executed or from illness remains unclear. The death of Aristotle's nephew, regardless of Callisthenes' actual guilt or innocence, cast a shadow over Alexander's relationship with his old teacher and troubled some Greeks and Macedonians who saw it as evidence of Oriental tyranny corrupting their king. But a darker incident had occurred even before this, one that would haunt Alexander for the rest of his life. At a drinking party in Samarkand in 328 BCE, Alexander and his companions were deep in their cups, celebrating after one of the Sogdian campaigns. The wine flowed freely, and the conversation turned boisterous, then argumentative. Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's oldest companions, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus River years before, began to criticize Alexander's adoption of Persian ways, his growing distance from traditional Macedonian customs. In his drunkenness, Clitus became increasingly bold, comparing Alexander unfavorably to his father Philip, suggesting that Alexander's victories were won by Macedonian soldiers rather than royal genius. Alexander, also drunk and his judgment impaired, responded with anger. The argument escalated. Friends tried to intervene, to separate them, to calm the situation. But in a moment of fury, Alexander seized a spear from one of the guards and struck Clitus, killing him instantly. The immediate aftermath was devastating. Alexander's rage evaporated, replaced by overwhelming remorse. He collapsed beside the body of his friend, weeping, calling Clitus's name. For 3 days, he refused food and remained in his tent, consumed by guilt. His companions feared he might die of grief or take his own life. Eventually, the philosopher Anaxarchus and others convinced him to emerge, framing the death in philosophical and political terms that allowed Alexander to continue functioning. But the incident marked him deeply. He had killed one of his oldest friends, a man to whom he owed his life, in a moment of drunken anger. It was a failure not just of judgment, but of the self-control that a king required. The death of Clitus revealed the strains building within Alexander's court and character, the tensions between Greek and Persian identities, the dangers of absolute power combined with the Macedonian tradition of heavy drinking, the growing isolation of a king who could not fully trust even his oldest friends. Part 22. Roxana and the Rock of Sogdiana. Amid the difficulties of the Bactrian and Sogdian campaigns, a romantic element entered Alexander's story. In 327 BCE, during the siege of a supposedly impregnable fortress known as the Sogdian Rock, Alexander encountered Roxana, daughter of a local Bactrian nobleman. The fortress was considered unassailable, perched high on sheer cliffs. When Alexander demanded its surrender, the defenders laughed, telling him he would need soldiers with wings. Alexander called for volunteers, offering great rewards to the first men to reach the summit. 300 of his toughest mountain troops undertook the climb during the night, using iron tent pegs as pitons, ascending the most impossible face where the defenders never imagined attack could come. When dawn revealed Macedonian soldiers above them on the heights, the fortress surrendered. And among the nobles who came forth in submission was a man named Oxyartes, whose daughter Roxana was with him. Ancient sources describe Roxana as extraordinarily beautiful, said to be the loveliest woman in Asia after Darius's wife. Alexander, whether moved by genuine affection, political calculation, or both, decided to marry her. The wedding was celebrated with Macedonian and Persian customs blended, Alexander cutting a loaf of bread with his sword and sharing it with his bride in the traditional manner. The marriage had political advantages. It created a bond with the Bactrian nobility, helping to pacify a troublesome region. But ancient sources also suggest real affection between them. And Roxana would remain Alexander's wife for the rest of his life, eventually bearing him a son, though that child would be born after Alexander's death. The marriage to Roxana symbolized Alexander's evolving vision of his empire, not Greek domination over defeated Persians, but a fusion of cultures, a blending of East and West into something new. Many of his soldiers, especially the Macedonian veterans, remained skeptical or opposed to this vision, but Alexander pressed forward with it nonetheless. Part 23. The Edge of the World. Preparations for India. By 327 BCE, Alexander had secured the eastern satrapies of the former Persian Empire. The guerrilla campaigns had finally been won. The rebellious satraps defeated or conciliated, the frontiers secured. He stood at the edges of the Persian world, looking beyond toward lands the Persians had never fully controlled, toward the mysterious east, toward India. The India that Alexander knew from geographical accounts was the Indus River system, the northwestern regions corresponding roughly to modern Pakistan and eastern Afghanistan. It was a land of legendary wealth, strange animals like elephants in vast numbers, powerful kingdoms, and philosophical traditions different from anything Greek or Persian. Alexander's army, now thoroughly mixed with Macedonians, Greeks, and contingents from across the former Persian territories, prepared for this new campaign. Fresh reinforcements had arrived from home. Though many of the original companions who had crossed the Hellespont 8 years earlier were dead, wounded, or settled in garrison duty across the vast distances already conquered. The crossing of the Hindu Kush Mountains into India was arduous. The passes were high and cold, the terrain challenging even for Alexander's experienced troops. But they pushed through, descending into the Indus Valley, into a world lush and green, steaming with monsoon moisture, utterly different from the Mediterranean climate of their homeland. The Indian kingdoms were fragmented, often at war with one another. Alexander, following his usual practice, sent embassies offering alliance or demanding submission. Some kingdoms accepted, becoming allies who would provide troops and supplies. Others refused, preparing for war. Part 24. The Battle of the Hydaspes. The most formidable opponent Alexander faced in India was King Porus, a ruler whose reputation for valor and dignity preceded him. Along the banks of the Hydaspes River, one of the Indus's major tributaries, Porus commanded a disciplined army that included an unprecedented weapon for the Macedonians: war elephants. These massive beasts, towering over men and horses alike, were clad in armor, their riders wielding long spears, and their very presence struck fear into the hearts of soldiers who had never seen such creatures. By May 326 BCE, Alexander's army arrived at the Hydaspes. Across the swollen, monsoon-fed river, Porus's army waited in formation. Elephants punctuated the enemy line, their gray hides slick with rain, trunks flailing and eyes gleaming with a mix of intelligence and fury. Macedonian horses balked at their sight, snorting and rearing at the strange, unfamiliar odor and tremors emanating from the beast's massive steps. A direct river crossing seemed suicidal, the water swift and unpredictable, the current ready to sweep men and horses alike into its depths. For weeks, Alexander engaged in a campaign of patience and deception. He staged repeated demonstrations along the river, marching, feinting, and harassing the enemy, drawing Porus troops into constant motion and exhausting them. Meanwhile, the Macedonian engineers and soldiers prepared a secret crossing far upriver, moving boats and supplies under cover of the storm-laden nights. Finally, during a night when thunder split the sky and torrential rain turned the river into a roiling torrent, Alexander chose his moment. A carefully selected force plunged into the icy, swollen waters far from the enemy's eyes. Rain lashed their faces, thunder masked the splash of oars and the shouts of soldiers, and by dawn, a significant Macedonian contingent had reached the opposite bank, soaked, mud-caked, but ready for combat. Porus, upon learning of the crossing, faced a harrowing choice. Leaving a portion of his army to guard the main riverbank against continued feints, he led the remainder of his forces across the plain to confront Alexander's newly arrived troops. The battlefield became a sodden, quagmire-strewn expanse, churned by rain and wind. The Macedonians arranged themselves into their familiar formations. The phalanx, long sarissas, bristling like a forest of steel, infantry steady and unyielding, cavalry poised for charges, their banners snapping in the gusting wind. Across from them, Porus's line was an awe-inspiring wall of steel and flesh. Elephants towered above the soldiers, armored and roaring, shaking the ground with each step. Cavalry and infantry alike braced themselves as the beasts moved forward, a living battering ram against human order. The clash was thunderous. Elephants charged, crushing men underfoot, scattering cavalry, and shattering the front lines. Horses reared and bolted in terror. Men were hurled aside, and the cries of combatants mingled with the bellowing of the beasts and the pounding of hooves in the mud. The battlefield became chaos incarnate. Alexander, ever the tactician, adapted swiftly. Light infantry, nimble and deadly, harassed the elephants, hurling javelins into eyes and trunks, striking the riders on their armored backs, aiming to disrupt the rhythm of the beasts. Macedonian phalanxes held firm, bristling with sarissas that created barriers even elephants hesitated to breach. Slowly, deliberately, the tide shifted. Some elephants, wounded and maddened, turned upon their own ranks, trampling soldiers in indiscriminate panic. Others fell, their riders unseated, the creatures finally broken. In the center, Porus fought atop his largest elephant, a mountain of muscle and armor, refusing to yield even as his army began to crumble around him. Wounded repeatedly, he cut through the Macedonian lines with the ferocity of a cornered lion, embodying the indomitable spirit for which he was famed. Yet the discipline, coordination, and relentless pressure of Alexander's forces proved unstoppable. By afternoon, Porus's army was in full retreat, routed, but not humiliated. Alexander, recognizing both valor and dignity in his foe, sent an emissary. Porus's reply resonated through history. "Treat me as a king." Alexander, impressed, not only spared him, but restored his kingdom, adding territories and forging a lasting alliance. Porus remained loyal to Alexander until the conqueror's death, a testament to honor amidst war. The Battle of the Hydaspes marked the last great pitched battle of Alexander's conquests. It was also the battlefield where Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved companion since childhood, drew his final breath, whether from wounds or the weariness of age. To honor his horse, Alexander founded the city of Bucephala, a lasting monument to loyalty, courage, and the inseparable bond between man and steed. Part 25. The Mutiny at the Hyphasis. After defeating Porus, Alexander pressed further east, toward the Ganges Valley, toward kingdoms he had heard were even more powerful, with armies even larger. But he was reaching not just the geographic limits of his possible conquests, but the limits of his army's endurance. The Macedonian and Greek soldiers had been on campaign for 8 years. They had marched thousands of miles from home. They had fought in deserts and mountains, endured heat and cold, adapted to strange foods and foreign customs. Many missed their families, their homes, the familiar world of the Mediterranean. And now, they found themselves in India during the monsoon season, rain falling day after day, equipment rotting, diseases spreading, facing the prospect of more years of fighting in ever more remote regions. At the Hyphasis River, the furthest point east that Alexander would reach, the army refused to go further. It was not a violent mutiny, but a quiet, firm refusal. The soldiers simply would not march another step eastward. Picture Alexander receiving this news, this unprecedented diffusal of his will. He attempted to persuade them, speaking of the glory to be won, the treasures ahead, the completion of their conquest of all Asia. He retired to his tent for days, hoping they would reconsider, that loyalty or shame would move them. But the army would not budge. Finally, Alexander performed sacrifices to determine whether the gods favored further advance. The omens, perhaps genuinely or perhaps interpreted conveniently, were unfavorable. Alexander announced that they would turn back, that the gods themselves had set the limits of his empire. The relief in the army was palpable. They cheered Alexander, grateful for his acceptance of their position, even if it meant leaving his ambitions unfulfilled. Alexander set up 12 massive altars at the Hyphasis, monuments to mark the furthest point of his conquests, and then turned his army westward, back toward the Indus, beginning the long journey home. The mutiny at the Hyphasis is poignant for what it represents. The first time Alexander could not overcome an obstacle through courage or genius. The first time, his will was thwarted not by enemy action, but by the simple exhaustion of his own men. He had reached the edge of his world, not because no further lands existed, but because even the most loyal army has limits to what it can endure. Part 26. The Descent of the Indus. Rather than immediately march back westward across the territories he had conquered, Alexander decided to explore the Indus River system, descending the great river to its mouth at the Indian Ocean. A fleet was constructed, hundreds of ships, to carry part of the army, while the rest marched along the riverbanks. The voyage down the Indus took months, from autumn 326 BCE into 325. It was part military campaign, as various tribes along the river resisted Macedonian passage, part exploration, as Greek geographers mapped the river and surrounding lands, and part sheer adventure, sailing through landscapes none had seen before. Alexander, characteristically, was not content to simply sail safely with the main fleet. He involved himself in every action against resisting peoples, leading attacks on fortified towns, personally participating in assaults where a general had no business risking himself. At one city of the Malay people, Alexander led an assault on the walls. As the attack seemed to falter, he grabbed a ladder and climbed the walls himself, followed by only a few companions. They found themselves trapped on the battlements, separated from the main army, under attack from all sides. Alexander leaped down into the city, his back against the wall, fighting desperately. An arrow pierced his breastplate and entered his lung. He collapsed, and his companions fought over his fallen body, while the Macedonian army, seeing their king in mortal danger, went berserk with fury and fear, breaking down the walls and gates, slaughtering every living thing in the city in their panic and rage. For days, Alexander's life hung in balance. His physicians worked desperately to save him. The army, encamped nearby, feared the worst. Rumors spread that he had died, and the entire expedition seemed on the verge of collapse, leaderless in a foreign land thousands of miles from home. When Alexander finally recovered enough to be seen, he had himself carried on a litter to where the army could see him, then insisted on mounting his horse to prove he lived. The relief and joy of his soldiers was overwhelming. They pressed forward to touch him, to throw flowers, to weep with gratitude that their king still lived. This incident at the Malay city highlights both Alexander's courage, which inspired such devotion, and his recklessness, which unnecessarily endangered not just himself but the entire expedition. At 31 years old, scarred by countless wounds, he still fought like a young man, proving himself, still took risks that no secure king needed to take. Part 27. The Gedrosian Desert. By late summer 325 BCE, Alexander's forces reached the mouth of the Indus and the Indian Ocean. Here, he divided his forces for the return to Persia. The fleet, under his admiral Nerkis, would sail along the coast, exploring the sea route from India to the Persian Gulf. Part of the army would march through the more hospitable inland routes. And Alexander himself, with a substantial portion of the army, would march through the Gedrosian Desert, a barren wasteland along the coast, largely unexplored, notoriously difficult. Why Alexander chose this route remains debated. Perhaps he wanted to explore and map the region. Perhaps he hoped to support the fleet by establishing supply depots along the coast. Perhaps it was simply another challenge, another opportunity to accomplish something no one else had done. Whatever the reason, it proved to be one of his most costly decisions. The march through Gedrosia lasted 60 days in the late summer and autumn heat. It was a nightmare journey through waterless wastes. The army struggled through sand and rock, supplies ran dangerously low, water became scarce, and heat exhaustion claimed soldiers daily. Baggage animals died, and their loads had to be abandoned. Discipline began to fray as men and women, for camp followers and families had accompanied the army, struggled simply to survive. Ancient sources describe the horrors: soldiers digging desperately for water, finding little or none; guides who became lost in the featureless landscape; flash floods that swept away those resting in dry riverbeds; hunger that drove men to eat whatever they could find; however unwholesome. The strongest struggled, the weak died, and were left behind. Alexander, according to the accounts, shared every hardship. When water was found and brought to him while his soldiers went thirsty, he poured it out rather than drink alone. He walked on foot when horses were needed for the wounded. He maintained discipline and purpose through sheer force of will. 60 days after entering the desert, the army emerged into the more hospitable regions of Carmania, in southern Persia. They had survived, but the cost had been terrible. Estimates vary, but thousands may have died in the desert, more losses than in many battles. It was a disaster born not of enemy action, but of misjudgment and pride. The fleet under Nearchus, meanwhile, completed its voyage successfully, discovering that the ocean route between India and Persia was navigable, adding valuable geographical knowledge to Greek understanding of the world. Nearchus's report of his voyage would become an important historical document, describing coasts and peoples unknown to Mediterranean civilization. Part 28. Return to Persia. When Alexander returned to the Persian heartland in late 325 and early 324 BCE, he found that his absence during the Indian campaigns had led to problems in the administration of his empire. Some satraps and officials, believing he might never return from his eastern adventures, had grown independent, misappropriated funds, oppressed their subjects, or plotted to carve out their own power bases. Alexander's response was swift and ruthless. Corrupt or disloyal officials were removed. Many were executed. Some were simply dismissed. He conducted a purge of the administration, attempting to restore proper governance and remind everyone that despite his years away, he remained firmly in control of his vast empire. But Alexander was also working on something more positive, his vision of a unified empire that truly blended Greek and Persian elements. In the spring of 324 BCE, at Susa, he orchestrated a mass wedding ceremony, an extraordinary event that would come to be known as the Susa weddings. Alexander himself married Statira, the daughter of Darius III, and also married Parysatis, daughter of the previous Persian king. His closest companions were also married to Persian noblewomen. 92 of his officers took Persian wives in a single ceremony conducted according to both Greek and Persian customs. Alexander provided dowries for all these marriages and offered gifts to any of his soldiers who had already taken Asian wives, discovering there were over 10,000 such unions. Picture the ceremony at Susa, a vast gathering in the Persian style. Pavilions decorated with silks and gold, Greek and Persian nobles mingling, the blending of customs and languages, music from both traditions. It was Alexander's dream made manifest, the fusion of East and West, the creation of a new kind of empire where conquerors and conquered would become one people. But not everyone shared this vision. Many Macedonian veterans resented these policies. They had conquered the Persian Empire, and now their king seemed to be elevating Persians to equal status. They grumbled about Persian dress, Persian customs, Persian officials appointed to positions of power. The tensions came to a head at Opis, a city on the Tigris, when Alexander announced that veteran Macedonian soldiers who wished to return home would be released with generous pensions and rewards. He may have intended this as a generous gesture, but the veterans interpreted it as dismissal, a sign that he preferred his new Persian troops to the men who had carried him to empire. Part 29. The Mutiny at Opis. The mood in the assembly at Opis was tense and angry. When Alexander made his announcement about sending veterans home, the soldiers responded with fury. They shouted that he should send them all home, that he should campaign with his father Ammon, a sarcastic reference to his claim of divine parentage, that he no longer valued the men who had won his empire. Alexander's response was characteristically dramatic. He leaped down from the platform and personally pointed out 13 of the ringleaders, ordering them arrested and executed immediately. Then he climbed back up and delivered an impassioned speech. He reminded them of what his father Philip had accomplished, taking Macedonia from a weak kingdom to a power. He listed his own achievements, the battles won, the territories conquered, always fighting at the front, sharing their dangers. He catalogued his wounds, his scars, proof that he had never asked them to endure what he would not endure himself. He pointed out the wealth they had gained, the honors bestowed, the cities founded where they or their children could settle. And then, in the crucial moment, he told them they were all discharged, that they could all go home, and he would conquer the rest of the world with his Persians. He turned and strode away to his quarters, refusing to see anyone. For 2 days, Alexander remained secluded while the army camp descended into confusion and distress. The soldiers, confronted with the reality of their outburst, began to feel shame and fear. They came to Alexander's quarters, standing outside, calling his name, begging forgiveness, saying they would not leave until he acknowledged them. Finally, Alexander emerged. The sources describe a moment of powerful emotion. Hardened soldiers weeping, Alexander himself in tears. A reconciliation was achieved. Alexander embraced the soldiers, particularly the older veterans. A great feast was held, celebrating the restored unity. At this feast, Alexander offered prayers and libations for harmony and partnership between Macedonians and Persians, for his peoples to be partners in rule rather than conquered and conquerors. It was a remarkable vision for the ancient world. This idea of a multicultural empire bound not just by force, but by shared interest and respect. 10,000 veterans did eventually depart for home, sent off with honors and wealth, entrusted to carry back the children of mixed unions to be raised in Macedonian fashion. Those who remained, whether from loyalty, love of campaigning, or lack of anything to return to, would stay with Alexander until the end. Part 30. The Death of Hephaestion. In the autumn of 324 BCE, during celebrations at Ecbatana, a city in Media, tragedy struck. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest friend since childhood, his most trusted companion, and probably his lover in the Greek tradition of such relationships, fell ill with a fever. For 7 days, Hephaestion battled the illness while his physicians attended him. Alexander visited constantly, consumed with worry. Then one day when Alexander was away attending games, Hephaestion's condition suddenly worsened. By the time Alexander was summoned and returned, his friend was dead. Alexander's grief was overwhelming and absolute. Ancient sources describe him throwing himself on the body, refusing to leave for an entire day and night, weeping uncontrollably. When finally pulled away, his mourning continued with an intensity that shocked even those accustomed to his emotional nature. He ordered the physician who had been treating Hephaestion to be executed, though whether this was actually carried out remains unclear. He cut his hair short in the ancient sign of mourning. He ordered all horses and mules in the camp to have their manes and tails shorn. He decreed that no music should be played in the camp. He sent to the oracle of Ammon in Egypt, asking if Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god, receiving permission at least for hero cult status. Most dramatically, Alexander ordered a funeral monument to be built in Babylon that would cost 10,000 talents, an enormous sum, a structure described as rivaling the great wonders of the ancient world in its scale and expense. Builders and artists were summoned to create a pyre of unprecedented magnificence. Picture Alexander in these weeks and months, a man who had conquered the known world, but could not save his dearest friend from fever. All his power, all his victories meant nothing in the face of this loss. He had lost close companions before, killed Clytus with his own hand in drunken rage, but Hephaestion's death was different, a wound that would not heal. Some historians suggest that Alexander never truly recovered from this loss, that the grief affected his judgment in the months to come, that it may have contributed to the recklessness and heavy drinking that characterized his final year. Part 31. Babylon and Final Plans. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander arrived in Babylon, that ancient city he had entered in triumph 8 years earlier. He intended to make Babylon his capital, the center of his vast empire, bridging east and west, just as the city itself bridged the Euphrates. The Chaldean priests of Babylon approached Alexander with warnings. They had studied the stars and omens, and they urged him not to enter the city, predicting danger if he did. Alexander, who had always been attentive to omens and religious matters, hesitated. But his advisors, including the philosopher Anaxarchus, argued that such superstitions should not govern a king's movements. Alexander entered Babylon. Despite whatever forebodings the priests had voiced, Alexander threw himself into planning his next campaigns. He envisioned an expedition to explore and perhaps conquer Arabia. He planned improvements to Babylon, harbor works, new buildings, projects to enhance the city's grandeur. He received embassies from across his empire and even from distant lands. Carthage, Italy, Ethiopia, peoples from beyond his borders, curious about or concerned with this new power that had reshaped the world. Picture Alexander in these final months, not yet 33 years old, master of an empire stretching from Greece to India, planning even greater expeditions. There was talk of exploring the Caspian Sea, of campaigns westward toward Carthage and the Mediterranean's western reaches, of circumnavigating Africa. His ambition seemed boundless, his energy undiminished by years of campaigning. He participated in the elaborate funeral ceremonies for Hephaestion, finally held in Babylon, with all the splendor he had ordered. The pyre was lit, consuming enormous wealth in tribute to a fallen friend. And then Alexander turned back to the business of ruling and planning, to the endless meetings and decisions required of an emperor. Part 32. The Final Days. In late May, or early June 323 BCE, Alexander attended a long banquet hosted by one of his companions, a Thessalian named Medius. The drinking was heavy, as it often was in Macedonian culture, where the ability to consume vast quantities of wine was seen as a mark of manhood and fellowship. During or shortly after this banquet, Alexander fell ill. What exactly happened remains one of history's enduring mysteries, debated across millennia. Did he contract a sudden fever? Perhaps malaria or typhoid? Diseases common in Mesopotamia? Was he poisoned by those who feared or resented his power? Did heavy drinking and years of wounds and stress finally overwhelm even his strong constitution? The illness came on quickly. Within days, Alexander was confined to bed with high fever. His generals and companions gathered, concerned, but perhaps not yet alarmed. Their king was young, strong, had survived countless wounds. Surely he would recover as he always had. But he did not recover. The fever continued. His strength ebbed. As word spread through Babylon and the camps beyond, his soldiers demanded to see him, to know the truth of his condition. Alexander ordered that his bed be moved so the troops could file past, each man able to see for himself that their king still lived, though weakening. Picture those final days, the great palace chambers of Babylon, the light filtering through high windows, the sound of the city beyond, and in a royal bedchamber, Alexander lying fevered and failing while the empire he had built held its breath. His generals gathered around, asking the crucial question: to whom did he leave his empire? The sources give different versions of his response. Some say he answered to the strongest, implying that his succession should be decided by capability and power rather than inheritance. Others say he answered to Craterus, naming one of his most capable generals. Still others suggest he was too far gone to give a clear answer, that he could no longer speak, that he merely handed his royal ring to Perdiccas, his senior cavalry commander, a gesture whose meaning was unclear. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BCE, in the palace of Babylon, Alexander the Great died. He was 32 years old. He had reigned for 12 years and 8 months. He had conquered an empire stretching across 3 continents, traveled over 20,000 miles, founded over 20 cities, changed the course of history, and would be remembered for millennia as one of humanity's most extraordinary figures. Part 33. The Aftermath. Picture the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death. Chaos and confusion spreading through Babylon like ripples on water. The generals gathering, each calculating their own position, their own chances at power. The army in shock. These men who had followed Alexander for years, suddenly leaderless. The vast empire, with no clear succession, dozens of peoples and territories held together by one man's will, now adrift. Alexander left behind two potential heirs, neither sufficient. His wife Roxana was pregnant, would give birth to a son some months later, but a child could not rule an empire. His half-brother, Aridaeus, was alive but mentally incompetent, unable to truly govern. Neither could hold together what Alexander had built. The generals, who would come to be known as the Diadochi, the successors, initially tried to maintain unity. They appointed Perdiccas as regent, nominally ruling on behalf of Alexander's coming child and his half-brother. But the strains were immediate and overwhelming. Too much power, too many ambitious men, too vast an empire to hold together without Alexander's personal authority. Within months, the wars of succession began. These conflicts would last for decades, tearing apart Alexander's empire, scattering his vision of a unified Greek-Persian world. The generals carved out kingdoms for themselves. Ptolemy took Egypt, founding a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra 3 centuries later. Seleucus took Syria and much of the Asian territories, establishing the Seleucid Empire. Antigonus, Cassander, Lysimachus, and others fought over Macedonia, Greece, and Asia Minor. Alexander's family met tragic ends. His mother Olympias was killed in the power struggles in Macedonia. Roxana and her young son, Alexander IV, were murdered on the orders of Cassander, eliminating the legitimate heir. His other wives faded into obscurity or death. None of his blood would survive to rule his empire. His body itself became a prize. It was preserved, apparently in honey or similar substance, and intended to be returned to Macedonia for burial. But Ptolemy hijacked the funeral procession, bringing Alexander's body to Egypt, first to Memphis, and later to Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded. There it was displayed in a golden sarcophagus, a tourist attraction and source of legitimacy for Ptolemy's dynasty. Later, Roman emperors, including Augustus and Caligula, would visit the tomb. Eventually, it was lost to history, its location now unknown. Part 34. The Legacy. Yet, if Alexander's empire fragmented and his family perished, his legacy endured in ways that shaped the ancient world for centuries and echo even now. The cultural fusion he championed, the blending of Greek and Eastern traditions, became the defining characteristic of the Hellenistic age. Greek language and culture spread across all the territories Alexander had touched. Cities he founded became centers of Greek learning. Alexandria in Egypt with its famous library and lighthouse, the crossroads of Mediterranean and Eastern thought. Alexandria Escate in Central Asia, numerous other cities bearing his name or founded by his veterans. The Greek language became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, facilitating trade, diplomacy, and the exchange of ideas. The Jewish scriptures would be translated into Greek in Alexandria, creating the Septuagint. The New Testament would be written in Greek. Philosophy, science, and art flourished in this cosmopolitan Hellenistic world. The great kingdoms of the Hellenistic period, for all their wars, create a world of interconnection and cultural exchange unprecedented in human history. A merchant could travel from Spain to India with Greek as a common language. A mathematician in Alexandria could build on work done in Babylon. Egyptian and Greek gods were syncretized, blended into new forms. Art styles mixed Greek techniques with Eastern themes. Even the rise of Rome, which would eventually conquer all the Hellenistic kingdoms, was shaped by Alexander's legacy. The Romans admired Greek culture, educated their children in Greek, modeled their conquests on Alexandrian precedents. Roman emperors from Julius Caesar to Caracalla looked to Alexander as an exemplar of military genius and universal empire. In the East, Alexander's invasion left lasting marks. He opened routes of communication and trade between Mediterranean and Indian civilizations. His campaigns brought Greek thought into contact with Indian philosophy and Buddhism. The Greco-Bactrian kingdoms that survived for generations in Central Asia created unique syntheses of Greek and Eastern cultures. The Indo-Greek kingdoms influenced Indian art, creating the Gandharan style that gave us the first images of the Buddha. Part 35. The Hero in Memory. But beyond political and cultural legacies, Alexander lived on in imagination and story, becoming not just a historical figure, but a legend, a symbol, a figure of romance and inspiration across cultures and centuries. The Alexander Romance, a fictionalized account of his life written in late antiquity, was translated into dozens of languages and spread across 3 continents. Persian versions portrayed him as a legitimate Persian king. Arabic and Turkish versions made him a prophet or philosopher. Ethiopian traditions claimed him as one of their own. Christian medieval Europe told stories of Alexander visiting paradise, of his encounters with marvels and wonders. He appeared in Jewish traditions, in Armenian legends, in tales told from Iceland to Indonesia. Different cultures saw in Alexander what they wished to see. To some, he was the perfect warrior, brave and unconquerable. To others, a philosopher king, student of Aristotle, seeking wisdom as much as glory. To still others, a tragic figure, achieving everything yet satisfied with nothing. Dying young with his greatest ambitions unfulfilled. Military commanders across history studied his campaigns. Julius Caesar is said to have wept when reading of Alexander's accomplishments, feeling he had achieved so little at the same age. Napoleon studied Alexander's tactics. Modern generals still examine Gaugamela and the Hydaspes for lessons in strategy and leadership. But Alexander was also a warning tale about the dangers of ambition unchecked, about hubris, about the corruption of power, about the price of glory. The king who killed his friend in drunken rage, who destroyed Thebes, who drove his army beyond endurance, who perhaps died from the cumulative effects of wounds and excess, who built an empire that could not survive him. Part 36. Reflections on a Life. As we reach the end of this long journey through Alexander's life, let us pause and reflect on this extraordinary figure. This young king who blazed across history like a comet and left the world forever changed. He was born into privilege but earned his place through capability and courage. He was given the finest education available, but proved himself on battlefields as well as in philosophical discourse. He inherited a strong kingdom, but expanded it into the largest empire the world had yet seen. He honored the gods, but claimed kinship with them. He loved deeply both friends and his vision of what the world could become. He was flawed, certainly. His temper could be terrible, as Clitus learned fatally. His ambition drove him beyond the limits his men could endure. His adoption of Eastern customs alienated some who had fought for him. His drinking was excessive, even by Macedonian standards. He could be ruthless when he judged ruthlessness necessary, as Thebes discovered. Yet he was also capable of remarkable generosity and vision. He treated defeated enemies with honor when they showed courage. He respected and preserved the cultures he conquered, adding to them rather than simply destroying. He tried, however imperfectly, to create something new. An empire not of conqueror and conquered, but of blended peoples. A cosmopolitan world where Greek and Persian, Egyptian and Bactrian could meet as equals. He lived just 32 years, ruled for barely 13, campaigned for 11. In that brief span, he traveled further and accomplished more than seems humanly possible. He crossed 3 continents. He never lost a battle. He founded cities that survive to this day. He opened routes of communication and trade that connected civilizations. He changed warfare, politics, culture, the very map of the known world. Part 37. The Eternal Questions. Questions about Alexander endure, because the man himself endures in memory and imagination. What drove him? Was it ambition, pure and simple? The desire to surpass his father, to eclipse all who came before? Was it a genuine belief in his divine destiny? The conviction that he was chosen for greatness? Was it curiosity? A desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon? To know what lands and peoples existed at the edges of the world? Perhaps it was all of these. a complex mixture impossible to reduce to simple motivation. Perhaps Alexander himself did not fully understand what drove him, acting from instinct and passion as much as calculation and plan. Would he have been content if he had conquered the whole world? Or would he, as some ancient writers suggested, have wept for lack of new worlds to conquer? The mutiny at the Hyphasis suggests that his ambitions truly were boundless, that he would have pushed ever onward if his army had permitted it. What would have happened if he had lived? If he had recovered from that fever in Babylon, what would his next campaigns have brought? Would he have conquered Arabia and then turned west, bringing Carthage and Italy under his sway? Would he have returned east, reclaiming India, pushing toward China? Would he have succeeded in truly blending Greek and Persian cultures into a stable, lasting synthesis? Or would his empire have fragmented even with him alive, too vast for one man to govern regardless of genius? These questions have no answers. History took the path it took. Alexander died young. His empire fell apart. But his legend grew and spread until it transcended history altogether, becoming something larger than fact. A story that each age could retell in its own fashion, finding in Alexander's brief, brilliant life whatever truths or lessons it sought. Part 38. The world he left behind. Picture the world as Alexander left it, in those months after his death when the structure he had built was beginning its slow collapse, but before the full chaos of the succession wars had begun. From Spain to India, from the edges of the Sahara to the steppes beyond the Black Sea, the world had been connected in new ways. Greek traders moved through lands their grandparents had never imagined visiting. Persian nobles spoke Greek and read Homer. Egyptian temples incorporated Greek architectural elements. Cities along the ancient Silk Road bore traces of Greek influence that would persist for centuries. The economy had been transformed. The vast Persian treasuries, hoarded wealth of generations, had been released into circulation, flooding the Mediterranean and beyond with gold and silver, stimulating trade and commerce on unprecedented scales. New cities needed goods and supplies, creating markets and opportunities. Knowledge had been spread and synthesized. Greek learning had encountered Egyptian science, Babylonian mathematics and astronomy, Persian administrative systems, Indian philosophy. The intellectual ferment of this exchange would produce the achievements of the Hellenistic age, the geometry of Euclid, the physics of Archimedes, the astronomy of Aristarchus, who proposed the heliocentric model 18 centuries before Copernicus, the medicine of Herophilus, who dissected human bodies and mapped the nervous system, the geography of Eratosthenes, who calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. The very concept of what empire could be had changed. Alexander had demonstrated that diverse peoples could be governed under one rule, that cultural exchange could enrich rather than weaken, that an empire need not be simply extraction and exploitation, but could aspire to something more sophisticated and lasting. Part 39. The Setting Sun. As our long journey through Alexander's life reaches its end, let us return to where we began, to that quiet space between waking and dreaming, to the stillness of this present moment. We have walked beside Alexander from his birth in Pella to his death in Babylon, spanning 32 years and 20,000 miles, from the fresh-faced prince taming an impossible horse to the world-weary emperor planning campaigns he would never lead. We have stood beside him at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, watched him found Alexandria, listened to the oracle at Siwa, crossed the Hindu Kush into India, survived the Gedrosian desert, and mourned with him at Hephaestion's death. All of this happened more than 2,300 years ago. The palaces where Alexander walked are ruins or dust. The cities he founded have been rebuilt countless times or abandoned to desert sands. The empire he created fragmented within years of his death. The peoples he ruled have vanished into the flow of history, absorbed into new cultures, new nations, new identities. Yet something remains. Not the empire, which could not survive its creator. Not the political arrangements, which proved temporary. But something more subtle and more enduring. The memory of what one human being, for all his flaws and excesses, managed to achieve through will and courage and vision. The proof that barriers can be crossed, that horizons can be extended, that the impossible sometimes yields to audacity and determination. Alexander's story reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary things, for good and ill. It reminds us that ambition can achieve wonders, but also exact terrible costs. It suggests that the boundaries we accept as fixed may be more permeable than we imagine, that worlds can be bridged, that different peoples and cultures can meet. Part 40. Drifting towards sleep. The night grows deep now. The oil lamps burn low, their flames wavering, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The story of Alexander has been told, this tale of a young king who became a legend, whose name echoed through centuries and across continents. Let your breathing slow further now, deep and steady, like waves upon a distant shore. Feel the weight of your body sinking comfortably into rest. Feel the day's tensions releasing, muscle by muscle, breath by breath. Picture one last scene, a map spread across an ancient table, the parchment yellowed with age, the ink faded but still visible. There is the Mediterranean, painted in blues and greens. There is Greece, Macedonia, the familiar shapes, and extending eastward, the vast territories Alexander traversed, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, Persia, Bactria, India. Cities marked with symbols, rivers drawn in flowing lines, mountains sketched in careful detail, but the edges of the map fade into uncertainty, into the unknown lands beyond where Alexander's footsteps ceased, where his story ends and mystery begins. Those unmarked regions remind us that for all he accomplished, there was always more, always further horizons, always new worlds waiting to be discovered. The lamp flames grow dimmer still. The map blurs in the fading light. The ancient world recedes, becoming dream and memory, history and legend blending together in the soft darkness. 2,000 years have passed since Alexander walked the earth. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have been born and died. The very continents have shifted, imperceptibly but truly. The stars above have moved in their slow celestial dance. Everything changes. Nothing remains exactly as it was. But on quiet nights like this, in the space between waking and sleeping, we can still visit those ancient times. We can still walk beside that young Macedonian king with his impossible dreams. We can still hear the tramp of armies marching, the clash of bronze on bronze, the cheers of soldiers, the whispers of conquered cities learning to speak new languages. And then we can let it all go, gently, peacefully, like leaves falling from autumn trees. Let the past be past. Let Alexander rest in his unknown tomb. Let the ancient world sink back into the depths of history, from which our imagination briefly raised it. You have journeyed far tonight, fellow traveler through time. From Macedonia to India and back again, across deserts and mountains, rivers and seas, through battles and sieges, victories and losses. You have followed Alexander's path, but now the journey is complete. Now is the time for rest. Now is the moment to release these stories, these images, these ancient struggles and triumphs, and simply allow yourself to drift. There is nothing more you need to do tonight. No decisions to make, no problems to solve, no distances to travel. Simply rest. Simply breathe. Simply be. The world Alexander knew is long gone, returned to earth and dust, living only in memory and story. The world you know will be here when you wake, patient and waiting. But this moment, this quiet hour, belongs to neither past nor future. It belongs only to rest. Let your mind drift where it will. If thoughts of Alexander remain, let them be soft and dreamlike, images without urgency. The horsemen riding across distant plains, the ships on moonlit seas, the campfires of ancient armies fading into darkness, the columns of ruined palaces silhouetted against stars. Let your breathing carry you deeper into rest. Each exhalation releasing more tension, more thought, more awareness. Feel yourself becoming lighter, as if you could float on these gentle breaths, as if consciousness itself were loosening its grip, allowing you to slip into the warm embrace of sleep. The story has been told. The history has been recounted. Alexander has lived his brief, brilliant life and passed into legend. And you, having walked beside him through his extraordinary journey, have earned your rest. Sleep now. Dream peacefully. Let the ancient world fade into the soft darkness behind closed eyes. Let your body repair itself in stillness. Let your mind wander in the landscapes of sleep, where time has no meaning and history is just another dream. The campfires of the Macedonian army grow dim on distant plains. The lights of Babylon fade in the Persian night. The torches in Alexandria's great library gutter and go dark. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, the same stars Alexander once studied, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. And in this quiet moment, millennia distant from his time, you rest. You sleep. You drift in the peaceful darkness that claims all stories eventually. The darkness that held the world before Alexander was born and holds it still, now that he is legend. Sleep well, traveler. Sleep deeply. The night is long and kind. The hours of rest stretch before you, gentle and restorative. There is nothing to fear, nothing to resist. Only the soft embrace of sleep, the natural peace that follows every day, the darkness that cradles all living things. The ancient world fades. The story ends. The night deepens. And you sleep. Sleep now. Dream peacefully. Let the ancient world fade into the soft darkness behind closed eyes. Let your body repair itself in stillness. Let your mind wander in the landscapes of sleep, where time has no meaning and history is just another dream. The campfires of the Macedonian army grow dim on distant plains. The lights of Babylon fade in the Persian night. The torches in Alexandria's great library gutter and go dark. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, the same stars Alexander once studied, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. And in this quiet moment, millennia distant from his time, you rest. You sleep. You drift in the peaceful darkness that claims all stories eventually. The darkness that held the world before Alexander was born, and holds it still now that he is legend. Sleep well, traveler. Sleep deeply. The night is long and kind. The hours of rest stretch before you, gentle and restorative. There's nothing to fear, nothing to resist. Only the soft embrace of sleep, the natural peace that follows every day, the darkness that cradles all living things. Breathe, rest, release, and sleep. The ancient world fades, the story ends. The night deepens,